Welcome to the Natural Reward Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Gilbert, and today is December 19th, 2021. I'm excited to be talking to my brother, Jon Gilbert, today. Jon is a software engineer and lives in Portland, Oregon, and has some ideas about wealth inequality and how to solve it. Jon, welcome to the Natural Reward Podcast.
Okay, so what's the actual problem that people are actually worried about when it comes to quote-unquote income inequality, which, by the way, I don't think is a very good term, particularly because, as we've seen, efforts to try to have actual equality in income where everyone makes the same amount, which is what communism tried, just abjectly failed and had a lot of deleterious consequences. So what we should be asking is, what is the problem with our current economy? And then what can we do to try to fix that? So one of the things that I wanted to look at was, well, people complain about how the cost of living keeps going up, but wages aren't keeping pace with it. And if you look at, say, milk and gas, right, from 1955 to 2016, the minimum wage went up by a factor of 10, but milk isn't $9.20 a gallon in 2016. Gas went up by a factor of 10. Now it's even higher, but I did this research in 2016. But you can see it's like, well, what's the problem? And now, of course, a lot of places now have like a $15 minimum wage. And so is cost of living really going up? But here's the problem, right? The cost of scarce goods in the economy is what has been accelerating away from the ability of people in the main pool of buyers to be able to afford it. So a house in Portland in 1955 was around $9,000. A year at Penn was like $950. A year of Blue Cross insurance was about $30. And the median income was around $4,000. So you could pay for a house in less than 3 years on a median income. You could afford a year of a good college for a fraction of your yearly income. Now, in 2016, median income was $53,657, but average house in Portland was up to $350,000. A year at Penn was up to $70,000. A year of Blue Cross was now $2,900. And so the change in income was an additional 1,297%, whereas housing went up by almost 4,000%, college went up by over 7,000%, and healthcare went up by almost 10,000%.
Can we discuss these figures really quick? I mean, for one thing, year at Penn is an Ivy League school. Obviously, like there's been more applications at the upper echelon of schools nowadays than it's a more difficult thing to get into, and it costs more and all that. In terms of the house price, okay, that's 1955. I'm thinking about our parents having bought a house in Austin in 1970 for, I think it was around $20,000, and they paid on that all the way until I think around 2010 or 2005 when they finally paid off the loan. So.
Well, they also added another $25,000 to it to basically double the size of the house.
But it was a lot longer than 6 years.
I'm not saying that like you would actually pay off your house that quickly, because normally what people do, right, is they get a mortgage of a certain length so that they're not paying as large of a fraction of their disposable income or their whatever their income is to that one expense. But the point is just that the average cost of prices, and you could look at, I mean, I agree with you that Penn may be an example of a college that is now considered to be pretty elite, but you're going to have a hard time finding any school that's costs didn't go up by 7,000% or 5,000% or 4,000%.
Yeah, so I mean, the only point is, I mean, for me is just that maybe it's not quite as bad as this makes it look like. There's also, with the housing market, a phenomenon of people moving to cities more than rural areas, and cities rents tend to be higher. That goes back to like Henry and George and just wherever you have the most wealth. you have the most inequality. The more people live in cities rather than out in the country, the higher the prices are going to be.
The problem is that the jobs are also in the city. And so what's happened, of course, is that people have been forced farther and farther away from where they work, which means they're spending an hour and a half a day traveling each way. And you're not getting paid for that, but it's costing you. And so that's also something that reduces people's overall happiness and makes them think like there's something wrong, with our current system. So, but let's just look at the percentages. Okay, so just as a ratio of yearly median income, we've seen these scarce goods increasing in how much of a percentage of your income is going to have to go to those things if you're going to buy it. And what's one of the effects that's had is fewer people buying houses, more people renting, fewer people going to college or going into extreme amounts of debt to do so, especially for people that went to grad school. And then, of course, healthcare, it hasn't gone up enough that like individual like insurance payments is a make or break it thing. But we know there's still a lot of uninsured people and a lot of people that can't afford it. So if that was able to be more affordable for most people, I think they would view that as a good thing, right? So now the median income as a calculation, though, could be considered to be distorted because it also includes everyone. So it includes people that make tons of money. And so that could be actually pulling that number higher. And so if we look at the median income of people who who pretty much make up the lower 90% of earners, what we see is that relative to their buying power, the amount of change is actually a lot more than what it is if you count all the wealthy people into this calculation. So for people making a minimum wage, you can see that minimum wage went up 1,000%. The lower 90%'s income went up by 1,154%. But all of these different expenses also went up a lot more relative to what they make. Now, if we adjust this to 2016 dollars, what you could see is that minimum wage in 1955 was like $13,186, whereas now it's like $15,000. The lower 90% income has actually gone up from 23 to 31,400 in 2016. And the overall median income increased a little bit more, but still not nearly enough to keep up with the increase of these scarce goods in their price. So if you're a 1955 minimum wage earner, you could pay for health insurance for a family of 4 in a year of college and have money left over. But nowadays, it doesn't really quite look that good. So this is just a graph showing the relative increase of these different items compared to what it used to be, what the ratios used to look like. And so
what does PDX stand for?
Portland. And I think Portland I just use as an example. It's where I live, but it was also a place that hasn't had at the time it was one of the fastest growing places in terms of real estate pricing. Now it's because of some recent events. I think people are less prone to move here, and like they don't want to live somewhere that the population is sort of tearing the city down, or that the perception is that anyways. And I'll admit that we do have a lot of problems in the city. But nonetheless, I think especially Austin would be even more. Like, I think the amount that it's gone up in the last 5 years even is really insane. So, but Portland, I think it works because we're also one of the members, we're not the fastest growing real estate economy, but we're also one of the ones that is increasing. Obviously, you can look at a place like Detroit as a counterexample, and I'm not saying there's not counterexamples to some of these items, but it's more just to look at the overall trend. if I do the same graph, so this graph we looked at before, with where the green lines are 2016, the blue lines are 1955. If we put CEO pay on this graph, you can't even see the whole other graph because CEO pay is so big now. And what that means is that everything that had increased dramatically compared to lower 90% has gotten like so much cheaper for rich people that it's like a joke, right? To them, the fact that it's gone up by that much doesn't matter at all because they make so much more than everybody else that it's like a drop in the bucket.
So I got a question about this graph. So you can see on the bottom part the two green lines, bars extending to the right. Is the top one the CEO pay from 1955 or what is that?
Okay, so what you see in this top graph is this graph in the top portion of this, okay, which literally it shows minimum wage. Blue is what it was in 1955. Green is what it is now in adjusted dollars. So as you can see, the minimum wage adjusted for inflation has remained static. Blue Cross has gone up a lot. 4 years at Penn has gone up a lot. House and PDX has gone up a lot. Medium income has gone up a little bit. Lower 90% has gone up even less. And then if we were to just add what CEO pay was in 1955 to now as just one more item to that existing graph, then it stretches so far off the graph you can't even see where it stops. So my point is, if you add that to that graph, now what you get is to fit it on the screen, right? We have to shrink the other thing so small that you can't even see what it is. So, okay, so let's forget for a second about how much more CEOs make now relative to everyone else, right? And let's just look at the ratio that has increased since 1955. And remember something important, which is cost of living. And I think this is the key that gets left out of this discussion, but it's the key that really to understand what the problem is. If you look at what MIT's living wage calculation is, which is honestly based on if you had pretty cheap housing, like $600 something a month for rent, which is really hard to find anymore unless you're like sharing a room in a house or something in my town. I don't know what it's like in Austin, but I bet it's worse. And it's also only based on 190, like some other pretty low expenses that really you would actually have more. The point is that what they calculated a living wage to be was around $31,300 or $31,400, which is right about what the lower 90% make in 2016. Then when you factor in almost $3,700 in taxes, what you get is that person will have $11 left over after cost of living goods. So after they've paid for housing and food and transportation and healthcare, they basically have nothing. So their ability to contribute to the consumer economy depends on them going into debt. And this is why we have a huge credit card industry preying on these people and banks preying on these people with overdraft fees and, payday loans and people living month to month, right? And that's...
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So lower 90%?
That's the median income if you filter out the top 10% of wage earners from the equation.
That's the median of the lower 90%.
Correct. It's a good representation of the people who are working an entry-level full-time job. Maybe they're not making minimum wage. Well, this was 2016, so this was based on a $15 an hour job, which was actually pretty good pay for that point in time. And as we've seen, right, because of this problem that you see right here, this is why anyone making less than $15 an hour was being totally screwed, right? So that's why we've seen this push for people to raise the minimum wage to at least where if you're working a full-time job, you've got enough to live, right? And not just be constantly going into debt.
But what would it be in terms of total per year? income?
$16,000 a year. Total poverty.
So they can't even pay for living expenses, and they're just going into debt.
Right, which is why you see single mothers, if you've got a kid, right? This is with no kids. If you've got a kid and you're just trying to work and make an honest living, you're working 2-3 jobs. The rest of the time is commuting, and like you're not there to raise your kids. And then the kids get into crime, and it's a vicious cycle. It needs to be the case that if I go out and I work an honest job for 40 hours, I should be able to cover my cost of living if it's a minimum wage job. Because what happens if I can't, then if I'm going to find something else like dealing drugs or gangbanging where I actually have a chance to make enough to have some money left over to spend on stuff, like I'm going to do that. And that's exactly what people do. And then they get shot or they go to jail. Now, so if worker pay had kept pace with CEO pay since 1955, then where would we be? So if the 2016 ratio of 204 to 1 is exactly 10 times higher than 1955, so that means that minimum wage would be $40 an hour if it had kept pace in terms of the percentage it grew by compared to CEO pay. And that's like $85,000 a year. I think most people would agree. If you pull in $40 an hour or more, you can cover your cost of living and actually have money left over to you do things like send your kid to a good school or something.
That's interesting, because that's actually my impression is that when I'm working, $40 an hour seems to me to be the minimum that I want to work for. That makes sense.
Right. Exactly.
In terms of paying for stuff and all that.
And so if let's imagine that in 2016 minimum wage was $40 an hour, then what would the other graph look like? Then you would see that the amount that minimum wage had increased by, rather than just staying the same in adjusted dollars, it would have actually increased by the same amount percentage-wise as all the other bars did.
That's interesting.
And if you plot this on a logarithmic scale, the difference between each of these two dots, like these lines these curves are the same exact curve, basically, if minimum wage had kept pace with CEO pay. So the question is why? Like, why does the expanding gap between, CEO pay, which very few people make, and median income affect the price of education, real estate, and healthcare, etc.? Right? It's mostly, I would argue that it's just simple supply and demand. When you have a scarce good mixed with high demand, like housing costs, the housing market is characterized by low supply, high demand, especially in big cities. And Eric Fisher is who did the study that showed that San Francisco rent was purely a function of how much people make divided by how much housing is available. And so, it's just supply and demand, right? So prices are set by how much people can afford to pay. And when prices outstrip the means of some individuals, but they can get help via loans or entitlements or insurance, then prices remain inflated. So that's where we've seen that extra debt that people are going into is the only way they can keep up. And so that's where you've seen mortgages have had to sort of relax how stringent they had to be about who could get a mortgage. And that created the housing bubble. And then the whole thing collapsed because it just wasn't sustainable, because they were giving loans to people that couldn't actually pay them back. And then where we went from there was, let's just dump trillions of dollars of quantitative easing into the economy in an attempt to hope that enough of that trickles down to the low income earners so that they can actually stay afloat. But that doesn't work very well, because that causes extreme inflation, and a lot less of that actually goes to the bottom line than does go to big companies and organizations and rich people who have apparatuses in place to allow them to benefit more from government programs than everyone else does. The big companies got these huge bailouts, but regular people got $1,000 check at the most or something.
There's a couple issues here. People might argue with what you just said about the housing bubble, and that it was driven in large part by the Fed and repeating the mistakes of interest rate policies that led to the 2000 internet bubble, and then doing the same thing again. And it was the various things that the Fed people, Alan Greenspan, did not foresee happening as a result of deliberate planning on the part of the government.
Well, those same people also have alternative history views of why the Great Depression happened.
I'm just saying it was in large part driven by the monetary policies of the Fed and the giving loans to people that couldn't possibly pay them, and having these AAA ratings for where people were putting their investments in the housing market that was not sustainable. And how did this happen? I mean, it came from, and this gets back to the question of how do you have the government get involved in plans of redistributing wealth when, in a lot of cases, when the government gets involved in this sort of thing, there are often these unforeseen consequences of policies.
Well, I'm not going to disagree necessarily with that. All I would say is that I think you're looking at another symptom of the problem, not the cause of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say too is that if you're looking at the median of the 90% of people, a lot of this is driven not by CEO pay, but the fact that the upper 50% of that bottom 90% are probably making a lot more proportionally than the bottom 50%. So in Austin, for example, it's not just about the Elon Musk and people coming here, but the fact that there are a ton of people in the top 50% that are they're making a lot of money because of the tech industry and everything.
Yeah. It's the fact that there's a segment of the economy, and whether you want to say it's 50%, or in my case, I'm factoring it as 10%, because I really think it's a lot less people than 50%. But I don't know exactly what the percentages are. But the point is that, yeah, there's a cutoff point, wherever that is in the percentage, where it's the people above that, where, because right, like if we go back to this right here, right, as soon as I make 50,000 instead of 32, what that means is I have 20,000 left over instead of 11. And so my buying power and my ability to compete for these scarce things just increased by hundreds of thousands of percent.
I think if you looked at these statistics in Austin, it would probably be pretty similar for the median of the lower 90%. If you looked at the average of the lower 90%, which would take into account the top 50% making a lot more, the average of the lower 90% is going to be much higher.
Agreed.
Than the median.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, because, well, the other thing is that remember this, the median income just takes the GDP divided by the total population, which includes people that aren't working, like children and old people and unemployed people and homeless people. So it's like, but remember, like, overall, we're sort of all bearing the cost of the people who aren't working. And so that's why they get factored in. And that's why that number looks so much lower, because that's somebody also paying for their kids and for their, this is like per person. This is how much per person total of the money is actually really like what their, so like if I have a kid, their cost of living is also, averages also out to that 32,000. So which means I need to actually be making 60 something to pay for me and my kid. Right. And it's also why the fact that couples working has had to happen a lot more now, because since the wages didn't keep going up the way that they did for, the top 10%, you end up with the case that now both of us have to work to afford what one person working could do, which means who's at home taking care of the kids? Nobody.
I think a lot of people would give it to you that today compared to the 1950s, it's much more difficult to pay for housing and college and healthcare.
There's some other things in there too. I mean, it's not just those things, but really anything that turns scarce in the economy has this effect happen to it.
Okay, so then what are we going to do about it?
Okay, so let's look at so we've looked at the symptom, and the question was, why does the expanding gap affect these scarce things, and it's just supply and demand. And another problem is that the gap keeps increasing due to what my hypothesis as to why is that it's a self-reinforcing feedback loop, because the gap is not just between median income and executives, it's also between the highly skilled workers in the workforce, like doctors and engineers and attorneys, the people who, what you were saying was in the top 50%, or maybe, it's anyone in the economy whose job that they do is in high enough demand that this effect starts to impact their income, because now they're a scarce good too. Now they start to ride the wave, kind of like surfing, right? They're riding the wave of how fast everything's accelerating, while everyone else is just back there anchored to this minimum wage, like a lead weight tied to their feet. And so even loans and insurance entitlement programs and things like that aren't going to help, because their cost as a percentage of the income after the non-scarce living expenses are considered is greatest for the median workers who effectively pay the disproportionately high salaries of people who are riding the wave in the form of taxes and insurance premiums and interest rates. And then there's the problem that, like, if you give everybody and this is why I'm very opposed to universal income, is like, if you give everybody this extra $2,000, now everyone just has more buying power, but that's just going to add fuel to the fire, because increasing the ability of people to compete for scarce goods is just going to make those scarce goods get even higher priced. So it's just like what we saw when they started to ease off the restrictions on loans, housing prices exploded, because now there's more people competing for them. And so it doesn't help you to do that. So I think some of the types of solutions that people typically like to propose for the income disparity, I don't like to call it an inequality, because again, no one's arguing that they should all be equal, but the degree of difference between the incomes is more the problem to me. And how do you address that? And the typical ways that people try to do so with, like I say, entitlement programs, or just give everyone money or whatever, is just, I don't think that any of those things are going to fix the problem. And so all these previous government schemes, which most conservatives would tend to associate with liberal policies, have failed. And that's why they failed, because again, it's just supply and demand. So if you increase the ability of people to apply demand to what's already in limited supply and won't be increasing in its amount of supply, you're just going to make the prices go even higher, and you're going to see massive inflation happen, which is exactly what we're seeing happen right now. So just to give some examples of that, because I think examples are good, the American Dream Down Payment Act and the GLBA failed because of this, because they tried to defeat housing costs by lowering the bar to get a mortgage and simplifying the mortgage process, which drove up housing prices by flooding the market with buyers unaware of the risks. And that's what caused pretty much almost destroyed the global economy in the housing. Now, you could look at individual acts that, like, the Fed did around some of this stuff, but it, was largely driven by these acts that were as much pushed by the conservative right as they were by liberals, and they were as much pushed by the legislative branch of the government as they were by acts of fiat coming down from on high from, the Fed and Alan Greenspan. Like, I think what the Fed was mainly doing was just trying to support some of the stuff and make sure it didn't fail, but it was a lost cause. It was the compassionate conservatism of the Bush years that is what really made sure this stuff happened, because they wanted to go for the Hispanic vote and the black vote, and this is where we ended up. It's also why Obamacare failed. So I'm not here trying to trash the Republicans, okay? Obamacare, similar problems. Too complex, too complicated, had a lot of problems. States were not prepared to implement these highly technical exchanges costing, like here in Oregon, we gave Oracle like $500 million to develop a healthcare exchange, and it failed and we never got it. And we had to use the federal government's one because the people in the state were incompetent at managing a technical project. And there's no way to revise the laws fast enough to solve the bugs in these complicated solutions that you put out there, right? So this is me as a software engineer looking at laws as if they were software. If I develop a solution and now it's set in stone because it's a law and we can't change it very quickly, because anything to change it's going to go through committee and and then everyone in Congress is fighting each other to block everything from being able to get solved because they don't want the other side to take credit for it. And so if something's broken and it goes into place, it's never going to get fixed, or it'll get fixed really slow. Again, this is also why I hate rent control things. Rent control is like, let's just say that it's illegal for rents to keep going up, right? Like you have to keep your housing cheap, which is very anti-free market and doesn't necessarily fix the problem, because it's usually also accompanied by laws that say you're only allowed to rent a rent-controlled place if you make below some threshold of income. And same thing with property tax incentives. So like here in Portland, when I was buying a place, there were places that if you bought it, you didn't have to pay property tax for 10 years, unless you made $1 over $75,000 a year. And then you had to pay all of the property tax. And so all these kind of thresholds, what they do is like, if I want to live in the $500 a month rent controlled apartments in downtown Portland, I have to make less than $20,000 a year, which means if my job offers me more hours or a raise, I'm going to just say no, because
Right.
because like if I make $1 more, I lose my freaking house, basically. And that's totally anti-capitalist. That's incentivizing people to fail.
Right.
And so this is horrible. This is also why other entitlement programs are bad. Financial aid for college hurts the middle class because any money that you have gets taken away. So you might as well like be unemployed for a year before you send your kids to college, so that when the college looks at your income, they go, well, they didn't make anything, so this person gets full financial aid, because anything you made, they're just going to take. And so people who don't go to college and just have kids and remain poor and get free money, but then people who actually went to college and tried to do the right thing, they get saddled with all this debt. So then they have to work to make no actual real extra income just to pay the debt off until they're so old they can't even have kids.
No, I mean, this is a common theme in socialism.
Exactly.
Is the creation of incentives that are counter to economic growth and higher standard of living for people working hard.
Exactly. So what I'm taking extra care right here to establish that I'm not setting up a pitch to try to sell anyone on the idea of some new entitlement program or universal income or anything. Like we have to think outside the box to fix this. But there is an actual real problem that we need to try to fix. But I think the kind of solutions we need to think about to fix this are so outside of the box that the only way to ever have them actually happen would require some pretty radical types of changes to take place. But let me just go over some more other things that failed. Communism, socialism, and dual currency systems like Cuba's dual currency, which was ill-conceived, and it created an underclass who didn't have access to the main currency. And so the secondary currency really just became the only real form of money. So its value stayed, but this other currency, since it was still just a form of money, could have its value crash since it wasn't really anchored to anything. Like you weren't guaranteed that your secondary currency could buy you anything.
Will you explain the background of dual currency and
Sure.
why Cuba implemented it?
Right. So the idea with multi-currency systems in general is to try to decouple some market forces from affecting one of those currencies. So generally speaking, you see this a lot, where I've seen it a lot is in, say, massively multiplayer online games, where the early ones had one currency. And what would happen is that would allow some players, the really rich ones, to totally manipulate the economy, and all the prices would get crazy now. So they would implement these multi-currency systems where there's some currency you get for just doing the normal quests and the normal gameplay that's non-transferable, but that you can use to buy the kind of average things you'll need to keep going in the game. So your cost of living goods effectively. And those are all kind of at a fixed price. So the value of that currency can't really crash because it's not like the people who accept that, the in-game characters that accept that currency to sell you things you need are going to just stop accepting that currency because it's worthless to them, right? They're just programmed to take it, so they have to. But in real life, right, how do you program someone to, like, we're in Cuba, essentially they had a scenario where like all the people who realized that this other currency was starting to go down in value just stopped taking it. So you would have as much of that currency as you want. You couldn't buy anything with it. And now you needed the other currency and there was no way to get it. And so all the people who didn't have access to the main currency pretty much were just this underclass who like don't have any money. So the system failed. And of course, Cuba is communist. So on top of that, but they were trying to like shift the way that the game works a little bit. And there's a link here on the screen. If you want to read more details into that, there's a link there. Now, there's an interesting trend, right? We've seen Bitcoin and these cryptocurrencies show up unannounced, and now they've shown how technology could potentially improve the concept of currency. It's almost like, it's kind of like how people could use a $1 gold coin. Like if I buy a $1 gold coin, I know that the gold in the coin is worth way more than $1. So I can sell a $1 gold coin on eBay and make a bunch of money. And there's this weird thing that's happened where people will pay in gold or silver US currency. And so that on the sales tax, they just count the currency value of what they gave for the product. But the seller is getting rare metals. And so they're willing to accept like $50 in gold coins for something that's worth like a couple of $1,000s or whatever, because they know the gold value of that currency is actually $50,000 or something, right? So, or whatever the real price is. But that way, it allows people kind of this way around having to actually pay taxes on their purchases, because if I just paid $50 in actual U.S. currency, right, then the sales tax is a percentage of that, not of the actual gold value of what those coins were. And so there's like weird loopholes like that, or like people.
I think I saw something where some old penny was worth like 500,000 or $1 million.
Right. So if you paid that penny for something, like, right, you could just save yourself a bunch of tax, because like, what's the tax on a penny? There's no lower, maybe at most like one other penny or something. Yeah. And so there's different forms of trading and investing and stuff that have come up. That's what like the corporate world uses for everything. So when corporations transfer wealth between each other for things, they're like, it's all done in really complex financial instruments that let them also kind of get around the same stuff in a lot of ways. And I'm not a finance guy, so I couldn't tell you how that all works. But what I know is that it doesn't help the average Joe, right? And how can we leverage a similar kind of philosophy, though, to help regular people? Because, and here's the problem, right? Capitalism, if it was a solution to the problem, then we wouldn't have the problem. So at least in its current form, capitalism has developed this situation. A lot of people blame capitalism for it, but I'm not so sure that the problem is capitalism as much as the kind of particular implementation of capitalism that we currently have. Like, what if we could even become more capitalist as a solution, right? Because whatever solution we come up with, it's going to have to get agreed to by both parties. And if it's going to get agreed to by the right, it's going to have to seem more conservative than what we have now, ideally. Like, what if we could get rid of the IRS as part of the solution and get rid of income tax and get rid of property tax? I don't know a conservative that wouldn't be on board with that, right? Like, if you could get rid of all that extra bureaucracy and make the government smaller while at the same time, then they would be willing to compromise on some other things, I think, because they would see that we're going in what the overall direction is. But I think overall the problem is that what what conservatism, the problem with it that I see is they focus on things like just deregulation and let the market decide. And the problem you run into there is a lot of regulations are there for a pretty good reason. Like, capitalism I look at it as kind of being like sports. It needs to be a competition, but also needs to be fair. And so to the degree to which we have regulations should be to ensure that it's fair and that we're not like destroying the planet or whatever, like that people still have rights.
And it's also worth mentioning that capitalism itself is based on laws that the government must institute.
Right, exactly.
The most essential being property laws, intellectual property laws, copyright, trademarks, patents, and then on top of that, antitrust laws, anti-lobbying laws, and then things like the Fed, which came out of early in the U.S.'s history, J.P. Morgan instituting a monetary policy to stave off a depression. And although people were happy about that, they're like, a single individual should not be able to control the entire economy. And so that's where the Fed basically came from, was doing that same sort of thing at a federal level. So capitalism itself gets lost out of a lot of these arguments where people take this, oh, it's just self-interested free market competition. No, it's fundamentally based on regulatory policies. It's not outside the box of capitalism to think about the ways that we can make it better. It's just that we have to be really careful about experimenting with, thinking through, and all that of what the policies are going to be, because almost every policy you institute is going to create various incentives.
Right.
And you want them to align with the greater good.
Exactly. It's all about managing the incentives. And I think most of the successful bipartisan efforts that we've seen have typically been in the form of coming up with incentive systems that incentivize good behavior by companies without making it a requirement to. So I think the energy credit system for lowering pollution, where companies who were very low pollution would gain energy credits that they could then sell to companies that weren't able to bring their pollution down as quickly. And that was a bipartisan bill that went through, and it really worked well. And if you think about it, that was actually an example of creating a dual currency system, because these energy credits were like a form of currency, right? They were something you could sell that represented some good behavior, right? It was sort of this abstract concept, but it was capitalistic in a way, because the price of the energy credits would be determined by the supply and so forth. So you need the supply and demand forces acting on the price in order for it to work, because otherwise there's no value to if I work hard to make my factory cleaner, then I'm going to get that payoff for that, because not as many people are doing that. And then the more companies do it, then the less the system is needed, because no longer is it particularly valuable to be the only company that's clean or whatever. And then you could just get rid of the system because it's no longer needed. So to me, any system we put in place ideally gets rid of itself. Like eventually it balances out. And then if it's kept around, it's just, maybe it's kept around just to kind of keep things from getting out of balance, but then it's not needed anymore. But, the thing that worries me is that even though we won, basically, we were the big winner from World War II. We were the first nuclear superpower. We maybe didn't have the biggest lead in the space race at the beginning, but we were a player. And then eventually we considered ourselves to have won by 1970. We got radar tech from the British that they developed, but they couldn't build it in the UK because they were just getting bombed to hell. So they pretty much entered into like a technology sharing agreement with us, which they really almost lost out of even being a nuclear sharing partner with us, but that's another story. But but nonetheless, like we ended up as the global reserve currency over the pound. They still don't like that. in the UK, right? That's still kind of like a issue, like they're grinding their teeth about, right? Because they gave us all their technology, and then we just ended up like getting, they got bombed into like the Stone Age almost, and then we're sitting here, and then we had like 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity at that point in time. But since then,
I'm gonna stop you for a second.
Yeah, please.
But I think a lot of people take issue with the first statement in this bullet point list here of the USA won World War II mostly because it was protected from devastation by oceans.
Right. I'm just saying we didn't incur nearly, the point of that is that we didn't incur nearly as high of a cost as like Russia did or the UK did, right? Because in Russia, they had like 10, 20 million people get killed.
You're saying the USA benefited more relative to the other allies.
Correct. Well, and especially relative to the non-ally, to the Axis. I mean, the Axis lost the war. I mean,
people just that simple statement would say, well, first of all, it's the Allies that won the World War II, not the USA.
Of course. Yeah, no, I mean, right. But...
And then on top of that, there are a lot of reasons that the Allies won. That's not just because the USA was protected by oceans.
I'm not saying that the war being won was due to the US. What I'm saying is that if you looked at the net benefit, like which country came out of World War II in the best position, having lost the least and gained the most in terms of competitive advantages, it would be the US, right? We had like a huge lead over other countries coming out of that because all our factories were still in one piece, right? We didn't have nearly as many people die. And so if you would have said to me, like if we just were playing some game and one country started with that big of a lead over everyone else, and then you extrapolated 50 years ahead and you said, okay, which country is in 50 years is going to have the best educational system, the most people that have healthcare, which of those countries will have, I don't know, everyone's able to afford a house, stuff like that. I would have said the US because we had such a lead on everyone else that we should still be the richest country, and we are, but not most of the people. And I think, there's just something wrong that just doesn't feel right to me. Like, it doesn't feel right to me that Japan has a way better educational system than we do, or that like people in the UK have better healthcare or something. You know what I mean? Like, and I get that like we've spent way, way, way more on defense and military spending. So it's almost kind of like a vicious trap that where Japan, wasn't allowed to have a military. So then they ended up wasting all this money on stupid wars and stuff. But anyways.
You're talking about high school education, not college. We still have the best university system.
Okay. I'm just talking about like the average education of each citizen of our country.
Yeah.
And I guess, this is just another example, right? The fact that our universities are so good and yet our people aren't getting that. I feel like that's kind of like part of the issue here. So again, we've been kind of taking the long road to talking about solutions, but I've just been trying to like set up what where my position is on like the background behind all this stuff, right? So we've had, of course, being like Trump, make America great again and all that stuff. And everybody kind of has their own idea about how to do it, but we haven't really seen one way to kind of poke out and be successful. But I don't think the liberal schemes to fix the wage gap will work. Capping executive pay, that's not capitalistic, and it could be difficult to enforce given how many different ways CEOs can get paid. Raising the minimum wage won't work because it'll only happen every now and then, and it's just gonna increase inflation because everyone will have more money. Universal income won't work because same problem. I also think that conservative policies are troublesome. Putting tariffs on other countries is just going to increase prices for consumers. And look what's happening in our ports right now. One of the things about that agreement was that goods coming into port wouldn't have to go through as many checks if it was coming from a trusted partner. Now, Trump just trashed that whole agreement. And so now there's like tariffs and the goods coming into port all have to go through a bunch of red tape. And so now you just have cargo ships doing circles out from in front of our ports, and people can't buy stuff that they want to buy because it's not in the store because it's on a cargo ship. So clearly that wasn't a good idea. Also, ignoring environmental issues like global warming or the big pileup of nuclear waste that everyone is ignoring, including the liberals, everybody. This could blow up in our face majorly. Like if global warming is a thing, which pro tip, it is, then we better damn well be doing something about it, right? So, okay, skipping some of those. The market is
worth mentioning, though, at this point, I would pose the question, do you think that the phenomenon of Trump has something to do with the situation
Absolutely.
where the bottom 50% can't make it and they're looking for somebody other than the standard politicians?
Absolutely. 100%. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's this party has been in power for X number of years, and look where we are. So the other party must have the solution, right? But see, that's not logical. Right? Like,
It's not, but I would say it's not that it's that he was a different party, but just that he was an outsider from Washington, and
okay,
people that felt like neither party was helping
right.
them were hoping that somebody that was not a career politician, even though he's the furthest thing from the working class you can imagine, he was appealing to them.
Right.
He was like going to those places and appealing to those people more than either the Republicans or the Democrats at the time.
100% agreed. And my stance is that I don't blame anyone for voting for Trump based on that. But also, I don't think that his approach to fixing the problem was going to work or is going to work. I mean, he could still run again because it has other problems that are different problems from the ones that the liberal policies have, but they don't really they're not sustainable solutions. They don't get at the root of the problem, and they risk kind of us going back. Whatever the solution is, it has to be based on market forces. It has to react in real time to the market forces that are at play. It cannot be that we're legislating some fixed number that everyone agrees seems like a good idea in whatever year it is that the policy gets passed, and then that policy stays in place for 10, 20 years until it gets changed again because it's now more of a problem than it is a solution. Whatever we do, it has to be able to adapt in real time to the market forces and stay relevant going forward. And I think what people like about capitalism in terms of its ability to have a supply and demand economy and the invisible hand of the market makes decisions and so forth, I think that's a valid consideration, but we also have to make sure that a solution that we come up with has those sort of things built in, kind of like the energy credit system did. And then, so I think one thing we should look at is look at some solutions that were fairly outside the box and maybe they failed, but that maybe there's another way to do it that wouldn't fail, like a dual currency system, perhaps. The energy credit system was a dual currency system and it worked. What can we learn from that? And not try and go back to things like the gold standard, because there's a reason why the gold standard was abandoned. No one knows if there's even any gold in Fort Knox anymore. Like, gold just has inherent problems. Another thing to look at is where does what are the inefficiencies in our current system? One of the main inefficiencies that I've seen is that everyone does all their purchasing electronically now using credit cards and banking cards. And the banking industry takes like a 1.5 to 3.5% cut on every transaction. So we're all paying off sales tax to the big banks every time we buy something. What if that same tax was going to pay our taxes instead? And then we'd have lower taxes and we wouldn't just be funneling all of our revenue to the banks that already have all the money anyway.
Isn't that what crypto is trying to do?
Exactly. That's exactly what crypto is trying to do. It's not what it's what it is doing. Except obviously the current transaction systems that like the banks have are part of the thing.
That's a difficult problem. I like the idea of the solution being somehow in the market. It's the approach I'm taking and thinking about how science works and how you can improve it. And a lot of the world environmental problems and things created by population growth and taking over the resources, pressing up against the limits of the world. People say they're created by capitalism, therefore we must get rid of capitalism. Yet capitalism is the thing that's led to innovation and creative solutions and new approaches to everything.
Yeah, we're going to need capitalism going forward. We just need to come up with a better way to do it, or ways to improve it. I do think that the conservative tendency to want to favor a system that's ruled by dynamic market forces in real time is key, right? We want to make a better version of capitalism, not necessarily just band-aid the current one. So here's some key points that I don't think we can avoid in the new system. One is that wages for jobs only rise when they are forced to, either by the government or by supply and demand. So sometimes like a trade union could show up that pretty much like demands higher wages. And we've seen that happen. That's why we have, a 40-hour work week, for example. But again, they're just really manipulating supply and demand by threatening to go on strike, which eliminates the supply of labor and kind of force the hand of the people with the money to raise the amount of which they're backing their demand with money to fix the supply problem. So again, it's just supply and demand, but probably not the most efficient form of it. And so market forces are always faster than legislation and probably also faster than having to go on strike. We can't get away from the fact that easy credit makes prices go up. All we could really hope to do, I think, is to reduce the need for credit by making sure that the buying power of the lowest paid workers is enough for their cost of living, and that more people are making money above their cost of living so they can contribute to the consumer spending without going into debt. Now, decoupling the value of currency from the value of a scarce commodity seems like it could necessarily mean that prices for scarce commodities will always rise faster than the median income of the currency that is decoupled. So right now, the US dollar, the value of the dollar is not directly coupled to anything. It can just go wherever it wants, where the market wants it. And so what that's I think going to always mean is that the ability for a dollar to buy housing is always going to go down for any scarce good. Because in the current money-based single currency system, you have these people at the top end of the spectrum that when their amount goes up, because they make more than cost of living already, anything extra they make is just more buying power to compete for the scarce goods. Their ability to compete for scarce goods based on a fixed percent wage increase is always higher than anyone who's below the cost of living threshold, because any extra stuff they make is just going to go to cost of living still, or to pay their debt off. So, okay, some considerations for a new approach. I would suggest that any new approach based on technology should deal with the risks inherent in that technology. So security, bugs, the requirement for electricity, which can fail. Any technology typically is susceptible to electromagnetic pulse, which we might think, well, when are we going to get EMP'd? But there's actually a pretty big risk of that if a foreign actor like North Korea was to set off a nuke in space above the Earth, or we get hit by a big solar flare, which will eventually happen, then there's going to be a massive EMP. And so anything that isn't properly shielded, anything that's not a good distributed system where parts of it can fail and the other parts can pick up the slack, is going to be too risky to want to actually base anything on. Another thing is that I would suggest that whatever system we come up with is going to have to somehow satisfy what both Republicans and Democrats want. So it should be somehow more capitalistic than the current system and reduce regulatory and tax burdens, make it easier for people to start businesses and pay workers. And yet it should also at least restore that wage gap back to what it was in 1955, so that people who make a minimum wage are actually able to afford to live and have some money left over and be able to afford things.
I've got a question based on what you said just then about the EMPs, the electromagnetic pulse.
Correct.
What about cryptocurrency? Is that something that's sensitive to EMPs?
Well, remember, it depends, okay? You can shield...
It is distributed throughout the world, right?
Digital technology in a way that it isn't going to be susceptible to EMP. So properly designed technology has shielding built into it and has things like fuses on the or cutoffs on the wire. So like, let's say I have a wire plug, like a USB cord plugged into my computer. If that wire acts like an antenna when there's an EMP, because it's a wire. Okay, so if it's not properly shielded, then that can actually get and have current induced in it that then fries my computer, even if my whole computer itself is shielded. So the computer has to have a cutoff where if current starts coming in from that wire past a certain threshold, it cuts it off so that the computer doesn't get fried. Now, most computers already have that, and due to FCC regulations, most wires are already shielded against EM, both so that they don't transmit interference to other things, but also so that they can't get interfered with. I just don't know the degree to which that shielding is sufficient for the more powerful kind of EMPs that we could get from a solar flare or like a space-based nuke and things like that. I'm just saying that whatever we do, if it isn't already shielded well enough to be able to survive past some of these inevitabilities, that we should make sure that it is. Because we don't want something that we know the sun's going to eventually do to just totally screw us. I mean, we pretty much already know that our current system would be totally screwed if there was a big solar flare like that. Like, we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in damages probably, but it's just something to be aware of, that we need to at least have that conversation, right? Now, the other thing is, whatever the system is that we come up with, ideally, it could be resilient against price fluctuations caused by supply and demand. So like, this is the problem with universal income. You give everybody $1,000 check right now. Like, I've heard people like Andrew Yang say that we should do, or Bernie Sanders. It's like, okay, well, $1,000 sounds like a lot of money kind of, but as soon as you give everybody that $1,000 check for very long, it's not worth the same thing anymore, because you're going to cause a lot of inflation and you're going to cause prices to go up, because just because you have more money doesn't mean the prices aren't going to get so much higher that it's not as if you had more money. It's like you really still have the same amount of income, and the market's going to adjust pretty quickly to that. And then once it does, now that $1,000 amount is sort of locked in the legislation, and there's no way to change it. If there's any fixed amounts like that, they need to change every day based on some particular metric. I don't know what that metric would necessarily be, but we can talk about it. Okay, so while we're at it, if we're going to put a system in place, everyone's going to need to have some kind of an account that they can use with this new system. Personally, I think we should be able to eliminate all forms of identity fraud, or at least 99%. Right? Because right now, somebody just gets your social security number and like your address and maybe a stolen credit card and then go to town. There's nothing to stop it. And it would be easy enough to stop this.
They could often do it just with the stolen credit card.
Right. But like, if somebody actually steals your identity, like they pretend like they're you and get accounts in your name because they just need your social security number, or they like file your taxes for you, things like that. So another thing I think would be great is if it was easier for people to get an ID, because I know Republicans want to have ID laws for voting, which Democrats are against because they feel like that it's hard for them to get an ID. A lot of people maybe don't have the birth certificate records, or maybe their name is slightly different on their ID, on their driver's license as it is on the birth certificate, because their name is in a foreign language and it got misspelled, or there's all sorts of roadblocks that tend to disproportionately affect minorities. That I think if we could eliminate all of that, it would make it a lot easier for people to be accepting of a system that requires you to have an ID. I also think we should make it way easier for people to start a company. In my ideal system, if all I have to do is just pay somebody and that's it. I don't have to file any paperwork with the state. I don't have to, maybe at the most I just sort of register my business name, and that's just as long as I have some name to operate under, and then I can just pay people. And if I pay you, that's income that you get. That's it. Like I shouldn't have to file a bunch of weird paperwork with the state and the city and get permission to have a business and then have to get a tax ID from the government or any of that stuff. Now, if I want my company to be a corporation, obviously that's its own legal entity. Clearly that would have to you would have to do the paperwork. But I'm just saying, like right now, as a private citizen, if I just want to hire people and just start a business as a sole proprietorship, there's a whole bunch of loophole, like just stuff you have to do that's just red tape that makes it hard to start a business. That shouldn't be like that. You should just be able to pay somebody and that's it. And also, ideally, we make it easier for people to vote. I think there's no reason we shouldn't have online voting. We do everything else online. We bank online. Nobody complains about banking online. Or it's like, oh, they'll hack my bank account. Right? Everyone just does it. Same thing with healthcare. You go online to do everything with healthcare. Does it mean there's not some risks or problems with it being online? Yeah, but it's still way better than what it was before it was online. And nobody complains about it. Nobody's like, I don't want to do healthcare online because, my ex-wife can get in there and see if I had a heart attack or something. Like, nobody says that. So why is everybody just all against online voting? It doesn't make any sense. Other countries have been doing online voting for a long time with no major issues. It's clearly a lot more secure than even like vote by mail. As long as you have a paper trail for it and it's cryptographically secure, it's very much free from manipulation, and there's ways to do it that we should definitely there's no reason not to be doing that at this day and age.
Do you have any clue like what percentage of the U.S. population has a cell phone? Your cell phone is something that can basically verify your identity with facial recognition, fingerprinting, all that stuff.
Correct. Well, in China right now, what they do is your face is your ID. Like when you go to the grocery store in China and you like put stuff in your bag and then you just look at a camera and it just knows who you are and which is kind of creepy, but it's not like we don't have that when you go to the airport.
So like, why do you have to go anywhere? And like most people have a cell phone. I mean, even poor people in Africa have cell phones and they're paying each other with text messages and stuff like that. I mean, just having a smartphone, you're able to verify identity, and a lot of people have them. And why do you have to go to like a voting station?
Really, there's no, I don't think that the barrier to get access to voting online would be such that it would be hard to do, or that the identification system, yeah, you're right, because you could use a cell phone. Obviously, there's nothing to stop someone from having multiple cell phones. If we're using it for something like voting, we've got to come up with something a little bit more than just you got to have a cell phone, right?
If you're the same person with the same fingerprint, the same face, how are you going to use multiple cell phones?
But that also means that your face and your fingerprint has to kind of exist in some account somewhere that is where there's a privileged position of, I'm the official server, so I qualify that this is this person because their face looks like that person, right? Like you have to have some kind of a centralized database for that to work. Now, generally speaking, centralized databases are hackable, right? If it's just one centralized database. But so I think whatever system we have, it needs to be distributed. So it has to live on a bunch of computers in a bunch of different places, which is actually what the internet was invented for, actually.
Well, that's what blockchain is, distributed ledger cryptocurrency.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. Yeah, right. Crypto works based on a distributed system, and the traditional banking system typically doesn't. Although I don't honestly know exactly how it works under the hood nowadays, but traditional corporate systems are centralized, not decentralized. So, but it's interesting to, as a little bit of a side note, the internet was originally developed as a way of creating a distributed communication network, because formerly, like the telegraph network was all kind of based in these hubs, and it was feared that if one of those hubs got nuked, then goodbye electronic communications. just interesting. So the ARPANET, from DARPA. Okay, so here would another great benefit, if we could have it, would be to eliminate tax. Like get rid of sales tax, get rid of income tax, get rid of property tax, get rid of IRS. I'm not saying get rid of all taxes per se, but if anything, just have one tax that gets paid at one place in the chain, and that's it. Everything else is outside the tax system. The only way to do that is with a multi-currency system, but I'll explain in a minute what my proposal would be for that. And then I don't know if that's the best one, but we can talk about it. And then lastly, if we can reduce government spending, we can make government smaller. That's great. Okay. So my proposed idea that is something called a labor exchange. So the idea is that whether you're a CEO or whether you're a minimum wage worker, companies have to pay you in, let's call it labor coin. If I'm a minimum wage worker, maybe I make 1 labor coin per hour. If I'm a CEO, maybe I make 1,000 labor coins per hour. Okay. But those labor coins have like a base minimum of 1 per hour that can never change. And those labor coins can be converted into dollars on an exchange where the more labor coins that you sell in exchange for dollars within a fixed amount of time, the more and more of a cut the government takes in terms of tax. And that tax goes to pay for the operating costs of the government, but also goes to help to defray the cost of the extra social programs or anything else that we might have that come as like a side effect of the transfer of labor coins to dollars. And I'll kind of discuss some of that. Now, the only reason to exchange a labor coin for $1 would be so that you can buy something that's not a cost of living good.
This is exactly what I've been thinking about, which is extreme wealthy being able to spend on conspicuous consumption, big trips, big houses, yachts. They have their private jet. They go on trips on the weekends. The things that contribute to climate change, using resources unnecessarily, those are the things that ought to be taxed more. And this is a way to do it.
Right. And so these labor units, the more you convert, the more the government takes. But here's the catch, right? If you have your labor coins, you could then use those to directly purchase up to a certain amount of cost of living goods. Because no matter what year it is, if it's 1955 or 2021, there's only so many gallons of milk or gallons of gas that a person might need to buy. In fact, cars have become a lot more fuel efficient. We need to have some kind of a way of deciding how much of a given commodity should be considered to be how much you need to survive. That takes into account things like the average fuel efficiency of cars for that particular year, or how much the average bus needs in terms of fuel or something like that. Because obviously how much gas you would have needed to buy in 1955 to commute would be different from now. But aside, the point is that there would be some amount that you could pay for with your labor coins. And if you pay for it with that, the company who you've given those labor coins to, now they have those labor coins and they can pay them to their workers. And there's no tax involved in that. So the people who are just operating in the section of the economy that is simply the cost of living, the people living paycheck to paycheck, the people who are essentially the cogs driving the economy because they're the average workers, right? They might not even pay any tax at all, because if they're just buying cost of living and they don't go past that, and then all their labor coin is just going to pay someone else's labor coin, and then the companies who are employing them are selling cost of living goods and getting paid in labor coin, then it's all just sort of a self-sustaining system.
It's basically a way to tax frivolous activities without implementing monetary policies or like arbitrary cutoffs that incentivize certain kinds of behaviors. It makes it a more market type of deal where it's You don't have these arbitrary thresholds that can change with the climate.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, like a minimum wage, that's anchoring you to a particular number that isn't going to be worth as much in the future. Where if instead what you're doing is you're saying that one labor coin is the absolute minimum you can pay somebody, just because like you can't go below one, let's say, and then you also say that one labor coin is always going to be good enough to buy 2 gallons of milk per week and 10 gallons of gas, or however much, right? Or enough to buy X number of miles worth of transportation or X number of square feet worth of housing. Then you're basically anchoring the value of the minimum wage to the price of things. This is definitely the area of this idea that would probably have to go through the most debate. I agree. I don't know the correct matrix or algorithm of what that would need to be, but we don't seem to live in a world where there's any shortage of good algorithms for manipulating things. We're really good at making up algorithms to...
Well, it need to be like a gold standard, but like something else that's more everyday. Like maybe housing. I mean, milk could change on if cows get some disease.
Right, exactly. Well, I think it has to, like if it was a matrix of various different things, you don't want to couple it to any one thing, right? That was one of the problems with gold standard, is it's coupled to just gold.
Yeah, it would need to be able to change with a bunch of different things in a way that if any one item changes drastically on the market, it doesn't impact the overall value of the labor coin.
Right. But clearly, like, MIT has like a cost of living index. There's these various different cost of living indices out there that we have. So something like one of those seems like it would be a good one to base it on. But whatever the case may be, the point would be to have it based dynamically so that it could change even day to day. And hey, if somebody holds on to if they save their labor coins as labor coins, they just have them building up. And then in the future, labor becomes worth more. And they choose to sell their labor at a point where it's worth more. Their labor coins would almost be like owning Bitcoin or owning a stock or something where you can actually kind of play that market, except you're not able to necessarily just if you go and buy labor coins, you have to pay dollars to get them. And the only way to get dollars is to transfer labor coins to dollars, which is where the government gets their tax.
Still, the rich might, and this would be a good thing, more incentivized to buy labor coins, buying a private jet versus buying some labor coins. And the labor coins are almost like a government bond or something that's stable.
Yeah, it's like if your argument is that we need to have rich people because they're the job creators. Well, here's a system where if you're a job creator, if that's what you're actually doing with your money, you're going to be way better off than somebody who's using it to buy expensive houses or whatever else. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the idea, but we'd also need to have some checks in place to make sure that these labor coins, someone can't just stockpile all of them and not use them to actually pay people. So they might have like an expiration date. Like if you have that labor coin, like you have to either transfer it into dollars by within a certain amount of time, or like it expires, or just automatically does transfer at a certain point, in which case you don't get to pick what rate you're getting for it. It just happens or something. So there's some different things I think we could do. But whatever the case may be, it's like we're not baking a particular money value into the system, and we're incentivizing people to be job creators, and we're easing the burden on the people who only just make cost of living by kind of using the people that pay the taxes at the most end of this system to kind of stretch the value of the bottom end. So it's not a redistribution of wealth per se. It's more of a rebalancing of the whole system. Okay, so it's like placing a low pass filter across the whole system where you're placing a dampening effect that is increasingly higher and higher onto the system, so that the person at the top end of the spectrum, they're still making the most of anyone, just not by as much. Because their buying power has decreased, unless you're just using it to create jobs.
The one thing I would say about what you just said was near the beginning when you said we need to have rich people because they're the job creators. I would say more like we need the job creators to be the ones that have succeeded, and we need the rewards to go to those who have tested themselves on the marketplace, so that the people that have succeeded on the honest test of whether you've done a good job, being the ones that become wealthy, who then know how to invest that wealth. Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly different take, but yep. I can see what you're saying. So, I mean, some people become wealthy and they invest it all back in their companies, and they're interested in just investment and innovation. I mean, Elon Musk is a great example of somebody that started a company, and then when he became rich, he invested all back into world beneficial activities, basically, with electric cars and space exploration. But there's still something called conspicuous consumption that has been a part of humanity for thousands of years, and it's, I can afford this and you can't, and because I can afford it, it shows
status symbols, luxury goods. And people, I'm not saying, again, it's not even to get rid of that. It's just that if you're going to do that, and people will, right? That's where tax comes in, and I think that's fine, right? Because that's already where we already have tax, like on sales
there's
tax.
Another aspect of conspicuous consumption that I think can be taken advantage of for the greater good. For example, when people throw these showy balls for promoting the boys club of Austin or something like this, where you get all these rich people in a room and you talk about what your nonprofit is doing, and them donating to this cause is their conspicuous consumption at this showy ball. And so there's ways in which you can manipulate that instinct.
You got to be careful about it, though. Not to just jump to the Bible to talk about morality, but there's a pretty good point in there, which is like, don't give to be seen giving. We want to try to avoid charities being able to be manipulated as just a way for people to to gain influence and things. So because then you can end up with like fake charities or charity, I agree with you that it would be good to have a way of getting people recognition so that conspicuous consumption can not just be about having a better car and all that. But it's an interesting question. But yeah, so what I was going to say here with this is up to the cutoff of cost of living right here. Any extra you make just kind of incrementally increases your buying power, because now you're just kind of less in debt. And then after you get past that point, that's when you start accelerating away from everybody else. And that means that the people past like the next cutoff are just like exponentially better off than the previous cutoff. And what I'm proposing is that the line should tend to more look like this, where the amount of buying power you get, from your first 20,000 labor coins is exponentially higher than the amount of buying power you get from your next 20,000 or the next 20,000. And so it's not like we don't have capitalism. It's just we're changing what the curve looks like. Now, if it needs to be linear or what the exact curve should look like, I think that's something that would be something we should do experiments with. Like we should do actual trials, like in a particular city or state, and operate the system for however many years and try to work out the kinks and make sure it's sustainable and it does what we need it to do. But this is, I made this slide, I can't remember why. No more stock packages or private jets for CEOs means you get paid in labor coin, period. Like you can't compensate people in other ways than labor coin. I think stock packages ought to be the one exception to this, because we need to come up with a way where stocks are kind of a proxy for labor. So you can invest your labor coin as stock without taxation, which you can kind of already do with dollars. But that would be the way to do it without getting taxed. Because if you just convert to dollars and then buy the stock, right, then you're going to get taxed on the conversion from labor coin to dollars.
That makes sense, because you're buying back into the economy.
Right. And then another thing, too, is no more offshore accounts. Like, if you're in this economy, any money you hold is in this economy. Like, there's no more tax shelters. Like, that needs to be a federal crime where you go to jail. I mean, because what we have now is people just cheat.
A lot of loopholes.
And they admit it. You have Trump saying essentially he wouldn't show his taxes, but then in the debate, he pretty much let on that, yeah, he doesn't pay much tax and neither should you. Like, if you're smart like me, you would also find the loopholes. And, clearly, I think we end up with now is like in Portland, for example, we have such high taxes that businesses don't even want to come here. And then you look at what our taxes are going to pay for, and it's like, we give out 1.5 million free needles to heroin junkies every year. During the pandemic, the city rented out these hotels at a cost of something like $4,000 a week for the rooms to house a bunch of homeless people because they were afraid of like the pandemic hitting the homeless populations. But we're spending like millions of dollars. But like we should be able to house our homeless. We're the richest country in the world. Like, why the hell can't we just build a bunch of houses and give them to people and just say like, hey, if you have a mental illness or you're somewhere that you can't afford to live, like, you get to live in this one, you can live in this place over here. And there's some stuff that it shouldn't even be a question. The fact that I drive around town and I see people camping everywhere because they can't live, they don't have a house, that's just broken. Like, we can't afford to build some houses, but we've got like 50 aircraft carriers and a bunch of nuclear submarines and all these stealth jets and stuff. Like, are you kidding me? What are we trying to defend? Some tents? Like, what could another country do to us that would be worse than having like 5% of our people living outside?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I think about sometimes what you see in poorer countries where people help each other. And I think about a boatman in Costa Rica that I know who got in a bad accident and needed some reconstructive surgery and had a lot of broken bones. And he didn't have any insurance or anything. And people that he knew just in the country that had money just helped him out. And he's living fine now. We're in this weird situation where we hope that the government does that sort of thing, but they don't. And so then kind of at a local level, people don't do anything about it. So it's like you either need the government to do it or you need it to be more local. But it can't be this half-assed thing where the government pretends like they're going to do it, but there's no system that actually works.
Another thing I think would be good is that about this idea is that if you don't have to file taxes at the end of the year, there's no taxes to lie on. You're eliminating a source of corruption. You're also eliminating all the bureaucracy that we currently have in place to administrate that. I would argue that if minimum wage through this system actually kind of got back to the level of what it was in 1955, we could also do away with the expectation that an employer has to give you your health care. Personally, I think the fact that employers have to kind of give you your health care is problematic for the worker, because that means if you lose your job, you lose your health care.
Yeah.
Even if you have money left over, you have to change doctors or you have to go find healthcare somewhere else. Like, just give universal healthcare to everybody and be done with it. Just eliminate another thing that has a big administrative overhead and that gets applied very unequally and unfairly. Right now, government employees have extremely good healthcare because counties and state governments have like super awesome deals made with the health insurance companies. So the government employees have like almost no copays or no minimums. And meanwhile, someone who's self-employed and has to go on the market, and maybe that person is somebody who's trying to start a company, and so they're also trying to think about how they can pay other people, but they just need healthcare for themselves. They're going to end up with a crappy healthcare plan and spending a bunch of money on it. Why should that person not have exactly the same healthcare as a county employee?
Can you go back to your graph? That's like your key idea. I just want to ask you some questions about it.
This one? Oh, this one.
Okay, so somebody might say, oh, well, I don't like this because it means if you become, there's no longer the carrot to innovate and become rich or whatnot. But see, it's only limiting you if you're using your profits to do kind of things outside of investment back into jobs and economic type of activities. It's only kind of limiting your frivolous expenditures, really, because it's like the example of Elon Musk, like going back to other companies, starting other businesses and creating jobs and all that. Then your wealth can still follow that first curve that goes upward. But if you're just wanting to buy stuff and have your fancy mansions and everything all around, that's kind of limiting your ability to do that. You could still be the ultra rich innovator who's rich in terms of his companies or her companies, but you're in terms of your like just living a fancy life is somewhat diminished. But that's not such a big deal because most talk about wealth inequality. I mean, it's not really the same thing as happiness inequality because the things that make you happy in life typically are pretty standard, and even people with not a lot of money are perfectly happy if they live their life according to certain principles and they're doing something creative, or they have children, or they have a family. You could go out on the lake here, go out in a kayak or a paddleboard and enjoy the same scenery as the person with the big mansion on the lake.
Right. Or you can enjoy it by getting paid to give people tours on the lake. And then you're getting paid to do it. Yeah. So agreed. I mean, yeah, if I am a job creator, if my wealth is going back into innovation and helping other people also make more money, then what we need to do is give that person the least amount of red tape and the least amount of roadblocks in their path to do that. And that is the drumbeat that I think the most attractive people on the right have been beating for a long time. Like that's the core of conservatism, really, is make it easier and less tax heavy to try to have a company and pay workers. And I'm all for that. Like I think that doing more of that will help the economy and help more workers. So, and I feel like that is what, if we can do that, if all I have to do to make a startup is just start paying people, boom, you're going to have like a ton of new startups like tomorrow. There's a lot of us, like I tried to start a company and I even had help, and it's just too much BS. Like I didn't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah, I feel like, if you're going to appeal to kind of the right in this country, you could have another curve on the right graph, which is your chance of getting into heaven kind of like decreases. It kind of goes down as your frivolous expenditures go up, and then on the right, it kind of mimics the curve.
Well, I think that you won't need to make a graph for them to understand that. I mean, that's kind of the core of Christianity, right? Is give to the poor and all that. But that's the other thing too, right? If I can give people labor coins, because a labor coin to someone who doesn't have any is worth way more than it is to someone that already has a bunch of them. Once you've covered your cost of living with labor coins, all the labor coins you get after that are only good for investing and paying other people. But if you don't have enough labor coins, somebody gives you one, that's huge. And that's it, just even further maximizes the power of what donation can do in that sense. And I think that if we did that, right, a lot of the problem we have now is not necessarily that people don't have support networks, it's just that their support networks can't cover them. And so if you enhance the power of private organizations and private citizens to improve people's lives with donation, those donations go way further. And now they're way better at helping to solve a lot of the social problems we have. And then you might not need all the government programs or as many. I'm not saying we should get rid of them. For example, universal health care, free housing to homeless people seem like kind of no-brainers. And I don't think most conservatives would be against it if they knew they were also getting rid of the IRS.
So, I mean, there's nothing that a conservative loves more than avoiding taxes. And if you think about conspicuous consumption and showing up,
right,
showing that you can afford something that your nearest competitor can't, and you're talking about like the situation of the showy ball, you might be donating in that case.
Right.
So you're transitioning from showing up your competitor by frivolous expenditure to transferring some labor coins to some people that really need it and avoiding taxes at the same time.
Exactly. So that's what we have, whatever this thing is that we create, it's going to have some things about it that a lot of people would initially have a knee-jerk reaction against. Like the idea of a national ID card is something that a lot of people have been resistant against because they're afraid of the federal government gaining too much power or using systems of control on people and things like that. And so, right, but you can't really do this if there is no citizen account that your labor coins go into. I mean, I guess with Bitcoin you could maybe, but
is a distributed ledger type of thing that removes like the central system, and everybody's checked by the blockchain or whatever.
yeah, right. That could help. But I've given some thought to this, and I'll tell you what I would like to see. So right now you have an ID card. It has your picture, it has your address, height, weight, or whatever you weighed when the ID was created, in my case, eye color. Like, it has all this other information that you could just look up the picture and see that, well, but maybe not. But then, are you a donor? Like, that has anything to do with identifying yourself, which it doesn't. And it has like an ID number, and then your date of birth. And just to buy a drink, you have to give all this information to somebody. Like, what? Why? All they need to know is this, right? They just need to know that this is the ID of the person that they're talking to, and that this is their date of birth. They don't even need to know the exact date of birth. They just need to know that it's greater than today minus 21 years. So I think that if people think that what we're trying to do is now everyone has to get like a federal ID that has all this stuff on it, and it's maybe even more controlling, I'm saying no. Get rid of this. My ID is just like a chip. That's all this is. And it has like my picture on it. The part of the human brain that's the most advanced is the part that recognizes faces, right? People are really good at facial recognition. Our brains are highly attuned to that. So a really good photo here.
Oh, is the little beak on the left your mouth?
This is just a face. Okay, there we go. And this is a similar token-based technology to what, the chip in credit cards. And why we've gone to that is what happens is that this generates a unique token every time it's used. Rather than having a single number that never changes that somebody can get and then use to like impersonate you, it gives out a unique token that's a one-time use thing. So that if I want to apply for a job or get hired somewhere, my employer doesn't get my social security number. They just get a one-time use token. And the only thing they can use it for is to make sure I'm a citizen and to pay me. And that's it. And they're the only ones who can ever use it. As soon as they register it with themselves, nobody else can use that token. This technology already exists. This is basic technology that we use every day for almost everything else in our economy, just not for actually like making, fixing this problem. So the other thing about this that's great is it only gives out the information that the person who's checking it needs. I can use this token to only check what I need to check. If I'm hiring somebody, I can check if they're a citizen and then use it to pay them.
It doesn't say your sexual orientation to the person trying to hire you, or your degree of melanin in your skin, or sex.
Nope. No, nothing. I mean, some information about that would be in your photo potentially, but I think we could use a technology like Zoom with a voice changing technology, and then basically during the hiring process, a company isn't allowed to see what gender you are or what sex you are or what race you are. Like, it's illegal for them to even ask. And so they have to make their hiring decision and how much they're going to pay you based solely on your qualifications and based solely on how you answer the questions and things like that. Of course, the problem with that is you're going to have a lot of people argue that there can be implicit biases and different things, but that's a whole other debate. The point is that we can get rid of things like identity fraud if we just go to a smarter identity system. And you can look at what Estonia has done with that. But by having this token-based system where it generates a token one-time use, and then the person can only check what they need to check, like you go to buy a drink, all they know is, you're allowed to buy a drink, right? And then you could use that same token as well for things that aren't already on an ID that probably should be, like if the person's a sex offender, or if they're a felon, if they were dishonorably discharged from the military for misconduct. So now that person can't buy, an assault rifle or whatever regulatory needs we might have without compromising people's rights. I'm not against the right to own a firearm. I own a firearm, but I also think that there's people who shouldn't be allowed to own a firearm because they've lost that right. They through their own actions and choices and bad choices, right? So I think we could do that. And if we had this done correctly and just make sure everyone has one, and then I really think that we just need to make the assumption that if you live in the United States and you could speak English, then you're a citizen.
All right, John. Well, you've definitely put forth some ideas that I have not heard before. It's got a quality about it that just makes sense and would appeal to both sides. So thank you for being on the Natural Reward podcast. I hope you come on in the future, John.
I hope to be a regular guest.
Have a good one.
All right, later, brother.
For more information, go to naturalreward.com where you can leave comments and find links and references. I'm your host, Jon Gilbert. Thank you for listening.